Hello, and this is Conversations with Dr. Stephen Greer. This is Dr. Greer, and I'd like to thank the folks at the World Puja Network for hosting us here every 2 weeks. And there's a wonderful worldwide following for this program that's developed over the last couple of years, and I'm really appreciative for the World Puja Network giving us this time to bring you up to date on what DisclosureProject.org and the OrionProject.org and CSETI.org are doing, and also to bring you up to date on what's happening with the new and very historic feature film that we're working on with Armadeep Kalika, who has won an Emmy for his work in the film industry and who's agreed to collaborate with us on a very major documentary motion picture that we hope can come out later this year or early next, that will have the most definitive evidence and information on the ET and UFO subject, and also the science and technology angle of the secrecy that so many people in the world do not know about yet, and who we think need to know about. So that's some really exciting developments we'll talk about in a moment. I want to introduce our very, very special guest, Paola Harris, who I've known for many years. And Paola is a researcher in this area, dealing with UFOs and extraterrestrial intelligence. And she hosted me in Rome more than once, and I'm very grateful for that, and has helped us a great deal over the years. She's had experiences that date back, well, you can, I guess, back to the 80s, and certainly in that era, all the way back to Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who headed up the Project Blue Book and then started on his own investigating the UFO issue and concluded that they were very real. And she's done amazing work going all over the world, meeting with military and other figures and interviewing them. And she's going to be working with our film, which you can see more about at sirius.neverendinglight.com, that help us as sort of an associate producer to gather together more of the best evidence and interviews and contacts that can appear in this movie. And so I'm really excited to welcome Paola Harris to the show today. Thank you, Paola.
Thank you, Stephen. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Well, tell us a little more about your background and historically how you've been involved in the subject over the years, because it goes back for such a long time.
Well, yeah, it was an emotional connection, Stephen. I saw Close Encounters of the Third Kind and had an emotional reaction to it. At the time, I was an English teacher teaching science fiction, actually, and honors literature. And I saw this film, and I saw that Allen Hynek was the consultant with Spielberg, and coincidence, because my life is filled with coincidences, had it that that's how I've done all my work, is a series of serendipity coincidences. And I went to a wedding in Chicago and decided that I would drop by the Center for UFO Studies, and I never thought he'd be there in a million years, but he was. He came around the corner with his pipe, the famous pipe, that cameo that's in the film. He came around the corner and he said, my secretary said you speak Italian. And I said, yes. And he said, would you work with me on all the Italian sightings? And for 6 years, it was a personal relationship with Dr. Hynek and his wife and some of his kids. So I was a personal friend of his. But the most important thing about that, Steve, is that I knew it was real. It was not like, did anybody have to prove it to me, or, do I believe in it? I knew that this was a real phenomenon to be studied.
Right. And what's interesting is that his whole journey, where he was basically window dressing for this sham called Project Blue Book in the U.S. Air Force, and went on to, his most controversial moment was his swamp gas incident, where there was this big event that happened in Michigan, and then Gerald Ford, who was congressman for the era, was contacted by a lot of constituents who were outraged because what they had seen was clearly not swamp gas, but he made some off-the-cuff remark about that, and it got him into so much hot water. But ultimately, as he drilled down more and more and more on this issue, he came quite clean on the fact that we're dealing with something very real that was not just a natural meteorological phenomenon. And actually, said as much towards the later years of his life.
Yeah, he did. And the thing that I was surprised about him was that he was heavily into meditation and he was heavily into spirituality. To see a scientist do that and also do research. So what he did, he said to me also, he said, Paula, when we're looking at this, never throw out the paranormal, what you consider paranormal. He said, it isn't all nuts and bolts. He said, we're dealing with a very complex situation here, he said, because we live in a dimensional world, and I know, Stephen, you believe in that too, that the dimensionality, the time-space, the whole thing, it's all part of it, and you cannot just eliminate it by taking advantage of sightings and that's it, and doing the radar reports and that's it. This is much more complex than that.
Well, it's because we live in a multiverse that is transdimensional, and every thinking scientist knows it, and it's not a belief system. There's actually excellent science that's been done on non-locality of awareness, non-locality of consciousness, the work of people like Rupert Sheldrake at Oxford and Dr. John at the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab and others that I've worked with. And, the fact that it's not been covered properly in the scientific arena is just because, they're locked into sort of a Newtonian universe that's long been disproven as being all that there is. And it was actually Dr. J. Allen Hynek who coined the term high strangeness because of so many of the kind of phenomena. Now, I don't personally like, and I never use the term paranormal because I just think it's a misnomer, but I do think that when you start talking about actual ET contact, which our CSETI.org group has had a great deal of, you're dealing with all kinds of phenomena that's obviously within dimensions that are conscious, astral, thought, electromagnetic phenomenon that would not be predicted by physics, for example, things that are impossible to be done with a linear view of the cosmos that is limited to the speed of light of 186,000 miles per second. And I think that all the scientists that I know that are worth a grain of salt who've looked at this realize that that's what we're dealing with. But, it's not as mysterious as people would hold it out to be. It's just that the science and research that's been done that on things like the conscious quantum hologram, that is the universe, has simply not been pushed to the forefront of science and the mass media the way it should be, and that we're basically 50 years behind the times. A lot of people think that what we're doing is so futuristic, and I'm going, actually it's not. It's been understood since Walter Russell was tutoring Nikola Tesla on the Universal One and the whole transdimensional nature of reality in the cosmos and the conscious universe, which was over 100 years ago. So if you go back 100 years, this information was at the apex of scientific thinking out there. In fact, it was Erwin Schrödinger who was the father of modern quantum mechanics. It was particle wave theory is what he specialized in, and he was one of the most eminent physicists of the early 20th century and late 19th century. And he's the one who said that the total number of minds in the universe is one. That is, it is a singularity. And that, in fact, conscious awareness is a single state that is then refracting and reflecting within each individual. And this is, of course, a very Vedic concept. Since we're on the World Puja Network, we can talk about these spiritual dimensions. But this is something that the most brilliant scientific thinkers, not religious thinkers, scientific thinkers, 100 years ago were elucidating. And yet somehow people find that this is revelatory in 2012 when it should have become commonplace. And this is part of, frankly, the cover-up. The deliberate refusal to acknowledge these things is part of an attempt to keep people locked into a linear Newtonian worldview, which would also lead to people accepting the status quo of the way the world is operating, not just consciously, but technologically. So the technological implications of this are huge, and there is a technological corollary to interstellar transdimensional travel and communication, which is very well known in classified projects, but which unfortunately 90% of UFO studies, people in that era, that really don't ever look at. But that's, of course, what we want to cover in this film. We want to cover the whole gamut of not just the nuts and bolts, as you might say, or the radar things, but also this whole concept of transdimensional reality and the importance of understanding that the way that actual ET civilizations will interface with a civilization like our own is going to be quite amazing and to some people mystifying, but it's only mystifying because the information about the science of consciousness and other transdimensional realities has been covered up. And I think it's so important that we put this whole package together in a way that can be understood by millions of people. And that's what is I mean, it's a rather ambitious undertaking, what we're doing with this film, but we feel it's so essential because we have got to catch the world up to what at least we should have known in 1908.
Well, down deep, I think everybody knows the truth, and I think down deep on some level they'll be able to resonate with what you'll put forth in the film, because the truth is just one. I mean, when you go ahead and show it to people, and we live in a very visual society, image society, so
right.
When you go ahead and do this, Stephen, it will be totally amazing. And my role is really just to do the international part. I mean, I can honestly tell you came to see me in Italy. You were, at my place near Ponte Milvio and so forth. It was a lot easier for me to work over there. It was a lot easier because it was more accepted, because they had a sense of history, because, you could discuss this kind of topic without all the retail stuff behind it, without the ridicule behind it, with all the marketing behind it. And so it's been very difficult for me, Stephen, to work here on this side of the ocean. But I guess my role is to bring together all the people that I know that, and a lot of the contacts I had there, mostly military pilots, credible people, in order to make the film richer. And I want to stress that, often people don't understand this is a planetary phenomenon. It happens in every country of the world.
That's right. It's not just the U.S. or Canada or even Western Europe. I mean, there's one of the things that Paola will be helping us with would be reaching out to people, for example, in South America, where, Paola and I were just at a conference in Arizona a couple of months ago where there was a Chilean general showing footage of a broad daylight at an air show for their Air Force where there was a craft that appeared and disappeared and was moving in a way that was just amazing. And what's happening in Latin America is that a lot of these countries, Paraguay, Uruguay, Brazil, Chile, and other countries are opening up their military archives, and you have military officers coming forward with this. And, of course, Mexico did the same thing with footage from the Mexican Air Force. And so what you find is that there's much more receptivity of being honest about this issue in other countries than there is in the United States.
Yeah, I think that it also, there's a lot more. Maybe there are a lot more sightings there because the people's hearts are open. I mean, this also resonates with the heart chakra. I mean, it's a different kind of situation in South America and Mexico and so forth. And people are always asking, how come they get such great footage? Well, obviously the receptivity is better in other places rather than here. And that's sad in a lot of ways because... Well,
I think there's actually I think there are plenty of pure-hearted people here. What we have found, however, because I've been leading contact expeditions since 1990, so it's 22 years now, and what I have found is that even though there was a globally positioned satellite warfare system that's been up since 1965, the concentration of military reconnaissance and firepower that is over the United States and parts of Western Europe is so impressive that when we have had craft, for example, at Mount Shasta that have fully materialized and begun floating towards us, they have been fired upon by aircraft that are in orbit that fire electromagnetic pulse weapons that has been witnessed by 40 people. This is not this is something that through testimony and evidence can be proven. In Arizona, after I saw you, we went out to Tonto National Forest, and we had this amazing contact where literally the sky opened up and this blue-white celestial-type craft appeared and put the whole group in this blue light. The next night, it started to come back, and there was an electromagnetic pulse weapon that exploded that was trying to suppress this transdimensional ET craft coming further into this dimension. And it was like it's hard to describe, it was like a detonation of a massive bomb in the crystal clear Arizona sky that everyone saw and heard. And yet there was no solid missile. It was an electromagnetic, what's called scalar longitudinal weapon. So what you have is that over other places, like in Latin America, even though there are satellite and other systems that have tracked and shot down ET craft, we have one of our disclosure witnesses who was on the Peruvian-Bolivian border when back in 1991 an ET craft was shot down and crashed there in the jungle. But what we have found is that the airspace over the United States and parts of Western Europe is so much more militarized and more concentrated than it is in some of these other areas that creates a suppressive phenomenon, and it makes it a very risky thing when ET vehicles want to fully materialize unless they engage in countermeasures, which they're reluctant to do because it will be spun the way Nick Pope recently did in that ridiculous article that came out last week in the Daily Mail, I believe it was, where he was talking about, alien invasion and the world military powers being prepared for this sort of interplanetary World War III invasion and all this kind of nonsense. So the ETs are trying to avoid confrontation with primitive societies, and primitive in this case, I'm not talking about the jungles of the Amazon, I'm talking about America and Great Britain, which has a very militaristic approach to the problem. And that's, of course, a very primitive and stupid approach. But that's unfortunately what is the predominant paradigm. And this is, of course, reflected even in the movies. One of the things that we've been dealing with in Hollywood is that in the last 2 years, there's something like 18 different movies that have come out, and $2 billion have been spent on shows like Battle Los Angeles and Battleship and many, many other very xenophobic, alien invasion-themed movies that are indoctrinating the masses of people in a way that I believe is preparatory for them accepting some kind of a threat which is non-existent. And I think that this non-existent threat is the way that the military-industrial complex wants to keep their multi-trillion-dollar hegemony running. And this is really a sad thing. And what you find in these other countries, like in Chile, they're not tied into that agenda the way the United States and Great Britain and some other countries are. And so I think that is a very good thing. And that's why we want this film to not only to have international scope in terms of photos and videos that Paula is going to help us get, but also these witnesses, because we want the public to realize that this is a global reality and we need to function as a planetary society in a peaceful way with this, rather than it being sort of dominated by a sort of a xenophobic, militaristic, military Anglo-American perspective. And this is something that I think can best happen through a film that will feature not only a global perspective, but also reach people throughout the world. So our intent is that this would be a global release. In fact, I just got back from L.A., and we were meeting with some folks who are actors and producers in Hollywood who are very excited about this project. And we were talking about, having the international rights and broadcast for this secured as soon as possible, so that even if people attempt to block it from being seen in the United States, it would be seen very prominently in Latin America and throughout Europe and China. India, for example, has a huge interest in this. Japan, Korea. We've had people who are on our team who have wonderful network connections in those countries where we want this film to be a global release that really addresses this in a way that has a global perspective.
And do you think, what I like about you is you have such faith that humanity, that the people will come forth if they're properly educated, if they're properly called forth to do something. So do you think that this will happen, that enough people who are touched will help with this?
Well, I do. We just through our own little network, well, it's not so little, but I mean, we put out a call just in the last 6 or 7 weeks for funding, and we have already raised $215,000 of the $250,000 we need to get this production done, just in 6 or 7 weeks. And this has been without any advertising. We have no paid staff. We have no office. We have nothing. And so the response has just been so amazing. And what we're finding is that when we roll this out, that when the public sees it and it can be streamed, and see, the wonderful thing about now versus 10 years ago when we did the National Press Club event that eventually was seen by about 1 billion people worldwide, but we didn't have the ability now where every smartphone and laptop computer and smart pad can stream a movie like this or can have access. So now we have the ability to put things out there. And, when we put the Paola interview up last year, a year and a half ago, this man who didn't want me to release his information, he had worked with the CIA and Siemens Corporation on the RF, the radio frequency chips that are being placed in people who are being abducted by the paramilitary workers. Most people think it's aliens, but it isn't. It's a cabal of paramilitary people making it look like aliens, and using PLF, program life forms, and costumes and things that look like UFOs that are man-made anti-gravity devices from Lockheed Martin and my uncle's old company, Northrop Grumman. But when this man came forward with this information, he forbade me to release it until he died. And when he died, his wife sent us a death certificate and a permission slip, and so we put it out there. And, within a few days, almost 600,000 people had viewed that. And so what I'm finding is that the people really are hungry for the truth. It doesn't get out through the big corporate media. You certainly wouldn't see his interview on CNN or what have you. But with YouTube and with other social media, we're able to reach so many more people than could be reached 10 years ago. And this being released, we're going to do a series of world premieres with this movie. And I think that between that and the networks it can go out through, that we can reach 1 to 2 billion people is our goal. And that was rather ambitious, but I think it's what we have to do in order to educate the public. And I think when the public are educated on the facts and on the full scope of what this means, they will then begin to get behind what needs to happen in terms of the changes in the future, the transformative changes. Because I think most people, they kind of look at it in an epiphenomenal way. They go, well, someone saw a craft there or a being there or had this sort of experience here or there. They don't understand that the secrecy and the spin that's been placed on this subject, both to ridicule it and marginalize it, but also to make it look frightening, is because they want to keep it in a direction that if it does come out, it can be used by the military-industrial complex, as Eisenhower said, for military psychological warfare purposes. And I'm quoting now from a CIA document from 1953. But they also, most people don't understand, even in the UFO subculture, that the secrecy around the issue is that it's a science and technology matter. That when if you look at that film, and you saw it, Paula, that the Chilean general had of that craft in Chile, that's not using Jet A fuel from Exxon, and it's not using a solid rocket booster. It's a whole new trans-dimensional physics and electromagnetic physics that, if disclosed, would completely terminate the need for oil and gas and coal. On the one hand, it would liberate the world from the slavery, the macroeconomic slavery of power, the power system that exists today, where people are literally dependent on these circa 1880s energy systems, both the power grid and coal and oil and gas and even jet fuel. It's still a fossil fuel. And there are very powerful multi-trillion-dollar interests who don't want that to happen. But the public, the 99.9% of the world's population, if you take 7 billion people, there's only a tiny percentage of them that benefit from the current system. But those are the 200 or 300 corporations and families that have over half the net worth of the world, according to a recent Swiss financial group study. And those folks do not want to see their power diminished. And so this is really about the macroeconomic power in the world and how it has thwarted our evolution into a peaceful and just civilization of abundance, having free energy that isn't polluting, and that could liberate humanity from these huge problems of resource depletion, environmental decay, wars in the Middle East over oil reserves. I mean, China and Vietnam are about to go to blows over the South China Sea and who gets control over the underwater oil rights there. I mean, all of these problems are very much linked to this black curse called oil. And unfortunately, that and the environmental crisis are very, very serious, and no one has a solution. And what people have to begin to realize as they study this subject in depth is that, you know, when I was briefing years ago, the Clinton CIA director on this, he wasn't interested in seeing the evidence because he knew this was real because he had seen one. He said, why is this being kept secret? And why are they lying to Bill Clinton and me about the programs dealing with this? And I had to tell him, look, you know, if folks like you who would like to see this come out knew about it, and it did come out, and it was acknowledged as real by the powers that be in the government, that would create a situation where the entire global macroeconomic system would be transformed away from a handful of people controlling the whole world to the people controlling their own destinies at the village and local level. And this is a huge issue. And so the environmental and macroeconomic and technology part of this never gets talked about in any depth. And so that's the other thing we're going to be dealing with is we're going to have people who have been involved in the science and technology end of these issues who can speak to the science in a way the lay public will understand so that people can grasp the idea that the ridicule and secrecy around this issue is only it exists because there is a very powerful consequence to it being released. And that's why usually, whether it's the president or other senior people in our government or other world governments that I've met with, they often are told little or nothing about the issue. And it's the corporate and mid-level people who are part of a unacknowledged special access project is what it's called, a very highly compartmented project that deals with it. And so people go around chasing the phenomenon. The real secrecy that people have got to understand is driven by these geopolitical macroeconomic issues from a very elite group of folks who simply do not want the truth to be known, because it's not just going to have an effect on, you know, people thinking, oh, we're not alone in the universe, which in and of itself is a big story. But it will have an effect where, you know, if anyone drills down and says, well, how are these things moving like they did in that film that the Chilean general showed you and me at the conference 2 months ago? People are going to go, well, you know, how is that happening? There are people who do understand the physics of that, and we're working with them, and they understand the anti-gravity and electromagnetic systems and the high-voltage trans-dimensional or interdimensional ways that these UFOs are moving. And when that is elucidated and begins to be acknowledged seriously, people are going to say, well, gee, why don't we use that instead of oil? And the public, see, the masses will demand this change. It isn't the chances of this coming from the elites in Washington or London or Rome, from the president or the big corporate, is very, very, very unlikely. I've said this for 20 years. Disclosure Project was always about educating the masses as well as our leaders who don't know about this issue and doing it properly. But ultimately the change is going to be, as you put it, from the people who I do have faith in, because the masses of the people of the world are not these corrupt kleptocrats who are, you know, petro-fascists trying to keep the world under their control. 99.9% of the world have no interest in that, and they just want to live a peaceful and prosperous life and not leave the world in worse condition than we found it, and go forward in a state of evolution and what have you. I think it's only a handful of sociopaths who have this perspective of such domination and control that they would run amok of an entire planet, destroy the biosphere, and keep most of the world impoverished in order for themselves to stay in control. And that is something that will have to be explained very, very clearly in this film. Otherwise, the secrecy makes no sense. You can't say the secrecy exists without explaining why it exists. And when you explain why it exists, then the people are going to understand, oh, my God, this is not just about, little green or gray or purple beings. This is about us. This is about the future of the human race.
Well, on a personal level, first of all, you articulated so well. I mean, I admire you so much because you articulate what the story is. Because so many of my colleagues, when asked that question about the secrecy, start using the panic button, the panic mode, and I'm going, no, that's not what it is. If I hadn't met Colonel Philip Corstone, if I hadn't spent 2 years with him, I would not have digested the idea of the reverse engineering, the idea of using this technology that has been occulted for so long. I would, on a personal level, if I hadn't met him and he hadn't told me what he did in research and development when he was at the Pentagon, and how these artifacts could have benefited mankind, but the first thought was for the competitive edge of the Army. The thinking is all wrong. The thinking was totally all wrong, and this planet is really messed up as far as the thinking being for the people of the planet. So
right.
I talk about this constantly because for me it's logical. I don't think we're in panic mode or it would be War of the Worlds or anything unless we were brainwashed.
Well, and that's the problem with things like that just came out in this London paper last weekend, and the 18 movies that have come out of Hollywood, is that there is a brainwashing attempt. And I know a lot of the top, very top people in Hollywood who are not allowed to make this story. People have said, why are you crowdfunding from the public to fund? When every movie being done in Hollywood now is $100 to $200 million, they drop millions of dollars like nothing on just rubbish. I said, because the people who are funding that in these big studios will not reveal the truth about this issue. They will make rubbish that scares the hell out of people, like Battle Los Angeles, but they will not tell this story. And I've tried, and I have met with the top. When I say the top, if you Google the top 5 producer-directors in the history of the film industry, I've met with them. And what you find is that they'll be stopped before they can make this happen. So this is why Armadeep Kalika, Never Ending Light, and his company, and Disclosure Project have teamed up to do this, because we realize that it has to be an indie, an independent film. It has to be something where it isn't corrupted by the corporate culture and by big money that ultimately corrupts it. And that is the magic of what we've done. And I have to just say, I want to thank everyone for their enormous support and outpouring of support in the last 6 or 7 weeks, where we've been able to raise $215,000 just from our own networking efforts. And we're well onto our goal of raising $250,000. Now, $250,000 for a feature film is very, very lean budget, and it's only happening because people like Paola and myself and Dr. Bravo and Dr. Loader and Tony Craddock, who does all the new energy work, and we have a dozen people who are sort of senior producers on this film working for free virtually. So what you find is that we're bringing to the project millions and millions of dollars in 20 or 30 years of research. But the thing is that if we said, we're going to hold out until we have a $5 or $50 million or $100 million budget to do the kind of thing that's done every day in Hollywood on these kind of trashy movies, we would be waiting until all of us are dead, because the reality is that the big studio and corporate world won't touch the true story. And that's why it has to be done by we the people. And that's why I've said to people, we're not only the producers all of us, not just me and Paula and Armady Kalika and others, but everyone who's contributing are producers, and everyone will be the distributor, so that when this movie comes out, they can rent their high school auditorium and get the word out and show it to 500 people in every community in the world. It has to be this kind of grassroots effort in order for it to happen, because the large corporate world will absolutely stop this at every stage. And I say this not from any kind of conspiracy theory. It's from having been at meetings with the senior executive producers for ABC News and CNN and people at Disney and at Fox and all these other big, and they'll say, oh, this is so great, and they run it up the flagpole and it gets shot down. And they'll say, oh, no, we can only do a fictional thing, or we can only do something that would scare the hell out of the public. We cannot do something like this. So people have often asked, why did I form my own company to get the books out there? If you go and look at them on Amazon, we have 4 books, Disclosure and my autobiography. And I said, because when this went to HarperCollins and other big book publishers, when they saw what was in it, they said, oh no, we can't publish this. So the truth, if I were to say I was abducted and raped by an ET, I could get a $500,000 advance and it'd be published by HarperCollins. But if you're putting out the truth, you can't get nothing. That's just the way it is. I'm just telling people blunt, frankly, as an ER doc, I just talk very directly. You cannot get anything. And in Hollywood, it's like that in spades. So this, we discovered, it would have been very hard to do this 5 years ago. Now it can be done. Not only can it be done through this crowdfunding mechanism that's gotten created, but through the independent world of film distribution. It's gotten more and more decentralized, and the Internet has allowed this to happen in a way that wasn't possible 5 or 10 years ago. So now we're at a point where we can actually do something like this without these choke points of the big corporate media stopping it, and that's what's really exciting.
Yeah, I think it is. And also, I was going to ask you, do you feel in any way this is ET-driven? Is it time for us to change our worldview? Is it almost, did we come to the wire here? And have we, grown up to the point where if people were properly educated, we would change this worldview?
Yes, I think that, the experiences I've had in the last year clearly indicate the timeline is a short one, and we need to make these changes. And that my own feeling about it is that, there's certain things that can be put off and kick the can down the road, but this can's been kicked down the road as long as it can be, because the secrecy is not only a very dangerous thing, as we have seen from this recent article in England, of how they're trying to spin this into sort of a alien invasion nonsense. But I think that the globe, you look at Gaia, Mother Earth, and the ETs are a lot of the people who've had contact with ETs get this environmental message and get this message about the future. We just cannot have 7 billion people living on Earth the way we were in 1880s using coal. People don't realize that, China and India is industrializing at 10% a year. They have 2.5 billion people. 82% of their electricity is coming from coal. Dirty coal, no scrubbers, nothing. It's just an environmental disaster. In the United States, we're getting to the fracking, and in Canada, the tar sands, which is a very dirty way of getting oil. We're living in this primitive, almost Mad Max world of filthy carbon-based energy, when Nikola Tesla and Dirac and other geniuses, T. Townsend Brown, had elucidated anti-gravity and energy from the vacuum of space around us, this sort of trans-dimensional energy field, 50 to 100 years ago. And that this is not only a crime against humanity, it's a crime against our Mother Earth. And this is why the Native American peoples that I've met with are very tied into what they call the Star People and the concept of living in harmony with the earth. And, this issue is directly related to that, because you cannot have a technological civilization living using fossil fuels, but for only a certain limit of time. And I think ideally that era would have closed in the early 1900s. And so we're about 100 years living on borrowed time, living in a sort of I don't know how to put this. It's sort of living in a Truman Show, a sort of like the movie.
Yeah, I
show.
saw the
sort
film.
Of, sort of living in this sort of delusional world where the public have been so misinformed on these basic issues about science, technology, ETs, non-local consciousness, deep spirituality, environmental issues. I mean, all these issues, and I think they're all completely interrelated, and that's what we need to have a really skilled storyteller like Armady Kalika help us do, because, I mean, I have my own skill set, you have your skill set, but I'm not a movie maker. And so we're really excited that somebody who's had the skill in movie making to have won an Emmy would be wanting to do this as an independent, relatively low budget film. And so, it's really exciting. And I do think the ETs very much want to see this happen, because we've had so many coincidental and serendipity sort of events happen over the last year that have made this come about so quickly.
Well, let me share a story with you that is in my new book, UFOs, How Do You Speak to a Ball of Light. I had heard that Marconi had a student or a partner, and when I was in Italy, Marconi's daughter came up to me after I finished doing a lecture, and he was a contemporary of Tesla. And so I did go to Imola, the city in northern Italy where this man was. He was now 93 years old. And I walked into his studio or his workshop, and I looked at the walls, and there were these beautiful portraits of what I thought were people from India. They had light around them. They had beautiful robes. And I said to him, "Oh, you've been to India. What beautiful portraits." And he turned around to me, and he said, "No," he said, "those people are not from India. They are the star people," he said, "and Marconi and I met them." And I said, "You met, were they, I said, flesh and blood people?" He said, "Yes, they were," he said, and they helped us with a lot of our inventions at the time. And he said, "And I want to show you one." And he showed me how he had harnessed the sun, this machine that actually dissipated clouds. And he explained to me that they had warned him, and they had warned Marconi that unless we did something more natural with our resources, and this man was using the sun for energy, that the Earth was in trouble. Now, after that, I began doing some research, Stephen, and I found out that the Vatican was who sponsored Marconi in a lot of his experiments. And so then I realized that all good, intentions sometimes have to be subsidized, and that's where that went. But I was in total shock, and the story of Pierluigi Ghina is in my new book, with his picture, with some of his inventions, and I was just blown out of the water.
What year was that when they had that?
1939.
Yeah, so that period between the late 1800s and the early part of the 20th century keeps coming up as a time when there were such great openings in consciousness dealing with these advanced concepts in science and physics. And because, these civilizations have been around for a long time. And, I was part of the Ancient Aliens series on the History Channel, and as you look at some of that, it's clear that, whether it's the Vimanas in the Vedic literature or the Nazca lines or Machu Picchu or what have you, there has been contact, and so we've been part of a cosmic society for thousands and maybe many thousands of years. But the modern era, where you go from, sort of a caveman existence or a primitive agrarian society to a technological one, it's a big jump forward where you cannot continue to live with billions of people based on, smoke and burning things as an energy source. And so, these brilliant minds that came to this planet during that period and whose discoveries have been suppressed is a real story that has to be part of this movie, because it ties in directly to the whole ET contact phenomenon and the message that they would like to see us move to this next level of civilization, to become part of an interplanetary society. And that, in the next few hundred years, I predict every planet in the cosmos will be united in an interplanetary society. And that's quick. I mean, that's, in less than 1,000 years. So I think that in order for that to happen, however, there are some fundamental changes that have to occur on this planet, which most people passively think that somehow it's going to be from the top down, like trickle-down change. It doesn't. It happens from the people up. And so, the old, I've said for about 20 years, if the people will lead, the leaders will follow. That basically it's the people who have to lead the charge in this. And so the responsibility ultimately is with the people. And most of the time people say, oh, well, when is Obama going to do this? And I said, no, you don't get it. We have to do it. And then it'll become an inevitability. And when it becomes an inevitability, then and only then do the power elites step in and say, oh, yes, of course. So I think that, leadership really needs to come from the people, and particularly on something like this, because you're dealing with such a transformation in the power of the world. Because if you look at how the world runs, the petrodollar system, the macroeconomic system, it's so tied into the science and technology end of the secrecy of the subject. And that's something that most people do not think about when they think of the UFO subject. They just think of, they think of abductions and aliens and sort of frivolity, frankly, and it's sort of a fantasy-prone subject. They don't realize really what's behind it. And so we need to pull that forward into the forefront so people understand what it's really about. And I think that kind of interview you're talking about is very, very important because it shows that there's this historical level of contact. And by the way, Walter Russell, whose Swannanoa Institute was literally 10 minutes from where I'm sitting right now at my farm in Virginia, was mentoring Tesla about contact with people from the stars and these higher states of consciousness. And he wrote the book, The Universal One. And Tesla was very inspired by this and reportedly also had contact experiences. And so many of the great minds and inventions, there is this interface that occurred. Unfortunately, ruthless people who were sociopathic and greedy kept suppressing it. And we actually have uncovered a document from the Department of Defense of the United States demanding that the FBI turn over the stolen papers of Nikola Tesla that the FBI seized the day that he died. And so for years it had been rumored that these papers did exist and were stolen by the FBI, and now we have a document that's a smoking gun that proves it.
Well, Nikola Tesla did have some kind of workshop in Colorado Springs. One of the reasons here in Colorado was because of our weather. In other words, he was using lightning, and he had a special tower. Well, the Italians that have studied Tesla, and by the way, Tesla came from Croatia, so if people would study his background, they know that he was very connected with the ET situation.
Right.
But the Italians that came to visit me wanted to see the Tesla laboratory, so we went to Colorado Springs, and there is not one sign of Nikola Tesla ever having been there.
And that's
the people, it's incredible, completely sanitized, because we went to the tourism board, we went to the city hall, we went everywhere to try to find out where that tower had been, where he was working, and they not only didn't know who he was, which really shocked me, but they couldn't tell us anything.
Right.
And this is history. If for no other reason, Stephen, it's history.
Sure.
It's part of our American history. It's part of our history that they would sanitize Colorado. Of course, I don't have to mention what's at Colorado Springs, but, it's
right.
So the thing is
Cheyenne Mountain.
Right. Well, the problem is that, we also had an incredible scientist that was working on free energy there. And,
right.
And there's no sign of that. If anybody was doing a thesis in the university, they couldn't even get research from there. So, and that's very sad. It's very sad because we should keep all of this as part of our human educational, wealth. And
more importantly, the world and the people of the world desperately need these scientific innovations, because there's all these hundreds of billions of dollars being spent by the Department of Energy on so-called alternative energies, and there's $1 trillion a year going to trying to abate global warming and fossil fuel effects and all this stuff, and yet we have assembled brilliant scientists and have been only trying to raise $5 or $6 million to open a research lab so that the work of Nikola Tesla and other people and a lot of the secret documents, we have a disk with thousands of pages of secret documents and patents on it that we've acquired where we could mail. We can't even raise that level of funding. And one of the things we want to do with this film is to educate the public so that people come forward and even through the revenue from the film can then go into this research and development facility, because you're not going to do this with a few $100,000. You're going to have to raise $5 or $10 million minimum to open up a properly equipped research lab. And let me tell you, I mean, the emergency department I ran for years, I mean, we spent $15 or $20 million a year just on this one ER. So, I mean, you cannot, when you're doing basic science research trying to bring out something like this, you've got to have some serious research and development funds. The people who've done it by themselves and stumbled across this, and there have been thousands of people who have, they keep getting their inventions sequestered. We a year and a half ago, the Federation of American Scientists released a study, and this is a mainstream group in Washington, and Stephen Aftergood with their National Security Project have found that there were 5,135 patents that had been stolen and had national security orders placed on them suppressing patents using the National Security Act, and some of them were just ridiculous. One of the ones he found was 40 years ago that someone had a solar generator that was more than 20% efficient, which is more than anything available in the market today, and it was seized, even though there was no weapon value to it, because it would have competed with the coal and gas industry in 1971. So this is not a conspiracy theory. This is the corruption that has suppressed these brilliant people like Marconi and Tesla and T. Townsend Brown and 1,000 other men and women who've worked in this area. And this is the core of why the whole UFO subject went so secret, because they knew that they weren't dealing with something burning Exxon fuel. So obviously, if you let this out, if you acknowledge that the UFOs are real from an official point of view, everyone's going to ask, well, gee, what energy source are they using? Well, it isn't going to be coal or oil or gas or even nuclear power. So this brings up this whole question of, someone once said, the truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off. And I think that the people deserve to know the truth about this, but then they need a focus of then what can we do about it. We need to learn about it. Then we need to put the resources together to come together as a people to bring out these sciences and technologies and to continue to form a global ambassador effort. If people go to cseti.org, you'll see that we're going to do a training in Colorado next week, but we're going to be up on Mount Shasta in August, and we're going to train people to make contact using these trans-dimensional, interdimensional concepts of consciousness and space and time interfacing with thought, remote viewing, all of these issues, because it's important that since the United Nations and the State Department isn't dealing with the ETs in a way that's peaceful and enlightened, it's incumbent on we the people to do that. And so we have launched this citizens diplomacy effort. Now we have an iPhone app, and soon we're going to have an Android app where people can learn these protocols. And we now have thousands of people all over the world doing this, from Malaysia to South Africa to Romania to Japan and everywhere. And I think the reason that's so important is that the ETs really want to see that there are humans that are attempting to reach out to them in a way that is peaceful and enlightened, as opposed to from a purely militaristic perspective. And I think that that is a signal they're waiting for as well. And so there's so many things people can do on their own. I mean, we have people who are just 2 or 3 people in a little community utilizing these contact protocols who have had amazing contact experiences. And I think that the reason for that is that the ETs are very much wanting to interface with humans, but within the correct paradigm of understanding, an interdimensional, higher conscious, spiritually, not religious, but spiritually minded manner that doesn't, keep this whole issue in a linear Newtonian box, but also isn't approaching it from the fear and panic and and military perspective that has dominated this field for so many decades. And so people, I mean, who are listening, who want to come, can come to join us at Mount Shasta in August. It's the dates and the information at cseti.org. And actually, Paula's going to be with us in Colorado next week, which will be exciting.
I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah.
No, it's going to be great. And the thing is that you're very right. It's the people that will have this kind of contact, and it's about time. I think that change can come, and I'm a real believer that it's ground roots. And I'm hoping that the consciousness and the conscience of the people that lead this planet, and think about generations and generations and their children's children's children, will change the way that they do business.
Yes, exactly. I mean, that's what we need. And I think that the morphogenic field that Rupert Sheldrake talks about, where the more people begin to do something that is evolutionary or coming together as a group of people, it potentiates that future. It brings that, good future into manifestation. And that's really important. And so I think too often we've been convinced, because we tend to be passive in front of our computers and televisions, that, just to not do anything. And I think that people need to realize that we can come together and bring the truth out through this film. We can come together and bring these science and technologies out. We can come together and be the ambassadors from the children of Earth to these other star systems. We can do that. We don't have to wait for Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama or Putin or the UN Secretary General to give us permission. We just need to do it. And I think that's been the message I've gotten since I founded CSETI and the Disclosure Project in 1990. And what I found is that people really are ready for that. People really are ready to step into that light and into that action and self-empowerment. And that's the only way change really happens, if you think about it, in the history of the human race. I mean, it is how it happens. I mean, the American Revolution didn't happen because King George wanted it to happen.
Yeah.
There were a bunch of ragtag people and others who got together, and including my mother's ancestors, and said, we're going to fight for liberty and freedom and a new civilization here in America. So, every change that's happened, not that it has to be armed, it can be peaceful, but it has to happen by people coming together, and that's why it's so important for people to do that. And not only the CE5 contact protocols, but this film that we're working on really is. I mean, the people are funding it, and as I've said, the people are going to end up being the distributors and the people who are going to be running their own little film projectors in high school auditoria around the world. I mean, I see this as being a very grassroots effort, and I think that's the best way for it to happen, really.
No, I agree with you 100%, and thank you for taking it on.
Oh, well, I mean, as we say, someone's got to do it, and so thank you for helping. I mean, one of the things that, I go into more detail, Paula's has such fantastic, really, I think better than I have, contacts with various research people and groups involved with this subject for 30 years all around the world, that, that's why I reached out to Paula Harris to help us identify the best photographs, videotapes, other foreign military and witnesses through different networks around the world. First of all, I'm too busy running this whole thing, but Paula has such sterling contacts all over the world and has collected so many great contacts and networked for decades doing this, and that's why it's so important and I'm very grateful that Paula's agreed to help us with that, because it's a huge undertaking, and we're doing this, as everyone knows, on a very, very limited budget, but thankfully Paula's been willing to help us with it, and over the next couple months we're going to march into the studio of this filmmaker, the best of the best of the best of the best, and that's what will be in this film.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Stephen. Thank you for the opportunity, because that's the real reason I work. It's for the education of the general public. It's for our kids. It's for the ETs. It's for us getting out of the planet and getting into the cosmic neighborhood,
exactly.
Which we should definitely be. That's where we should be at this point. That's where I want to be, and we're all walking this road together.
And as soon as we show as a people we can make this change and become a peaceful and mature and civilized society that's not devouring our own planet and murdering each other over oil or whatever, the cosmos, people are going to be stunned at how quickly the cosmos flings open its arms and embraces us. But we have some growing up to do. We have some changes. We have to take care of some things here on Earth, and only the children of Earth can do that. So that's what this is really about.
Well, good. See you soon, and we'll work on this together.
Yes, well, I'd like to thank you again for being with us here on the Conversations with Dr. Greer, and this has been a great time to share, and I do appreciate your efforts, Paula, and I will see you next week. And I'd like to thank again the folks at the World Puja Network for hosting us. Again, if you want to find out more information about the film, you can go to serious.neverendinglight.com. And the disclosureproject.org site has a lot of information about the military and intelligence witnesses. And if you're interested in coming out under the stars with us in one of these expeditions and learning higher states of consciousness and contact, you can go to cseti.org, that's cseti.org, and you'll see the schedule of our upcoming events over the course of this year. And those dates are already up and posted for anyone who's interested. So thanks again, and we will talk to you soon in another couple of weeks. Bye-bye.